and welcome to the Sociology of Sexualities. I'm Tina Fetner. This is the optional supplementary material for Module 9, Reproduction and Sexuality. I'm going to start by talking about the body as a social construction. When we talk about social construction, so far we've talked about sexuality as a social construction, we talked about gender and it's a social construction. What we mean by this is that the meanings associated with these ideas are constituted through historical contexts and social processes, right? So for example, the categories that are developed to describe sexuality, such as sexual identity or gender, are governed by social regulations, both formal written regulations and informal social norms. Right, and that these social regulations and norms are specific to historical times and places, right, and the social organization given in a particular culture at a particular point in time. But sometimes people are willing to understand that something like sexuality is socially constructed, but what do we mean when we say a body is socially constructed as well? We certainly know that bodies are physical forms, they're biological in nature. This is the moment when I want you to recall back early on when we were talking about sexuality and gender as social constructions, that I've tried to be very clear that if we say something is socially constructed, that does not mean that we are saying that is not biological. And in fact, it can be biological and socially constructed. That means that it can be organized through biological processes, but the meanings around it can be socially constructed, that is specific to particular historical context and particular cultures. I want to give you one example, and it's a good one. Let's talk about orgasms. So nobody is going to dispute that orgasm is biological. Right? Our ability to come to a sexual climax is physical, through physical manipulation, is a biological process, obviously. But what sociologists will point out is that orgasm is also socially constructed. That is to say, the ways that we understand orgasm, the ways that we produce meanings of orgasm are specific to particular cultural moments and particular historical contexts. Right? So let me give you an example. One of the cultural myths in our culture today is that male bodies reach orgasm more easily than female bodies. That is, the biological process that produces an orgasm in males is just a more simple, straightforward process, and that female bodies are a little more difficult to access sexual pleasure, and it takes more work to achieve the biological process that is orgasm. It turns out that this myth is exactly that. In fact, male bodies do not reach orgasm any more easily than female bodies, and the more that we learn about the biological process of orgasm, the more that we understand that these tissues in the female body and tissues in the male body are analogous tissues, and that in fact the biological process to produce orgasms is very similar in both male and female bodies. But the way that we understand it is organized around this myth. In fact, our entire culture's understanding of heterosexuality is that heterosexual sex is centered on male orgasm. That is, to be having sex means that a male is reaching orgasm or is coming. That you know when you're done with sex because the male has orgasmed, and that is a sexual process. Heterosexual sex is the moment, starts with male arousal and finishes with male orgasm, and that if it was good for a woman too, then that's kind of a benefit or a bonus. You may not think that this is maybe you have a different idea than this in terms of how your sex and sexuality is organized. But in fact, if you do some social scientific research, you do some interviews, you talk to people, this is a very dominant cultural understanding in Canada today. I say that because I have done some of this research, and so I'm saying that with some authority based on my own data collection. Let me tell you about that research that I've done. This is some work that I've done with my colleague Nicole Andrzejczyk. We did some survey research that looked at sexual behavior of men and women, and we asked them if in the most recent sexual encounter that they had with another partner, whether that was a partner was a man or a woman, we asked people if they had an orgasm or not. So here's the data that we found in our study. I think I have a citation on this slide. Nope, well, citation's on the next slide, okay. Women were much less likely to report that they had an orgasm in their most recent sexual encounter than men. Men were very likely to have an orgasm. About 90% of men had an orgasm in their last sexual encounter, as opposed to about 60% of women. This difference between men's and women's likelihood to have an orgasm in their last sexual encounter is called the orgasm gender gap. Let me show you a little bit of the analysis that we did. I know that students love to look at tables of coefficients from logistic regression, so I wanted to include some here for you. But pay attention to some specific things. I'll pull out some things for you to look at. Also this source is a little outdated. This is now a published paper. It's a 2019 paper in the International Journal of Human Sexuality. You can read the whole thing if you like. First, we wanted to see a couple of theories of what is producing this orgasm gender gap. And we thought that one of the things might be just a matter of physical expertise, right? That women who had more practice bringing themselves to orgasm through the practice of masturbation might be able to be more likely to achieve orgasm in a partnered situation. So we tested the relationship between masturbation and orgasm in a partnered scenario. We did not get a significant result, right? If we look then at a different kind of set of, a different hypothesis, this is kind of grounded in the literature as well, we looked at the nature of the relationship. There's some literature that says that when women are more comfortable with their sexual partner, or they had more experience with the same sexual partner, then those are the conditions under which women are more likely to achieve orgasm. We found some support for this theory. You can see that we have significantly more likely to, women are significantly more likely to have reported orgasm if their sexual partner was their spouse than if their sexual partner was somebody that they were a boyfriend or a stranger or a casual sexual partner. But we found even more evidence for the third hypothesis that we tested here, which was that, in fact, the orgasm gender gap was mostly just caused by the sexual practices, the kinds of sexual behaviors that people were doing. And when women's clitorises were stimulated through oral sex, they were much more likely to reach orgasm. So what we conclude from this is that couples that were more focused on clitoral stimulation produced more orgasms, surprise, surprise, and that one of the main causes of the gender gap between men and women is just the lack of attention to bringing women to orgasm, the lack of clitoral stimulation. And so that is what we know about orgasms. What does this mean for our understanding of bodies as sexually constructed? Right, what we know then is that the bodies have biological capacities, and this is true for women, and it is true for men, it's true for male bodies and for female bodies, but that social forces that are out there in the world organizing our lives every day are also operating in the realm of sexuality. That is that the meanings of sex and sexuality that we have constructed culturally, socially, right, act upon our bodies in these scenarios of couples having sex, our understanding that sex being sort of more about men's orgasms than women's means that it affects our behavior, and it makes us more likely to stimulate penises than to stimulate clitorises, and that this produces important meanings and contributes to our understanding of gender and inequality and sexuality. So that is our lesson in social construction of bodies through the lens of orgasms, but there are other important examples. For example, in your readings, in the textbook, there is an important example about the social meanings surrounding menstruation, another very biological process, also very socially constructed. For now, though, we're going to turn our attention to inequalities of bodies, right? And especially through the lens of maternal health, right? So we're going to look at maternal mortality rates in the United States because there's a particular social problem there where maternal mortality, that is the likelihood that women die either in childbirth or shortly after childbirth, is increasing. And that this increase in maternal mortality is not evenly distributed across the American population, but in fact there are significant inequalities by race. So in this case, racial inequality is impacting women's health, especially around the critically risky time of labor and delivery. Here's some handy chart for you that gives some evidence to the claim that I just made that maternal mortality rates are increasing over time. This shows you a period of time from 1987 to 2014. If you dialed back to look at the longer picture, you would have seen that over the middle of the 1900s, we saw a dramatic drop in maternal mortality. Right? This is over the 1900s, we went from a place where maternal mortality was very high. It was very risky to have children. Many women died in labor and delivery. And mostly through technical improvements, through understanding of germ theory, through new kind of medical, through the miracle of modern medicine, as they say, maternal mortality decreased significantly. And there was significant, and there continues to be significant global inequalities of maternal mortality because these kinds of modern medical achievements have not reached every part of the globe. I'll show you, I think, a little bit of data on that in a moment. But right now, take a look at this. It's gone up. It's not going in the right direction. And so we're not talking about, we haven't forgotten how to take care of people medically. Instead, we're looking at serious barriers to access to adequate medicine and healthcare being on the rise in the United States. This is not evenly distributed, as I mentioned, that in fact this is particularly focused on Black women. That Hispanic women have a slightly elevated risk of maternal mortality, but Black women have a significant risk relative to whites of maternal mortality. I also want to talk today about social activism and reproductive rights. Right? This is another related part to sociology of bodies and social construction. Right? Because control over reproduction is about women's bodies many times. The laws and the social regulation of birth control, of labor, of delivery, of the whole process of understanding reproduction is governed by policy in a way that is a bit more invasive, some would argue, more tightly regulated than it would be if not for the underlying forces of gender inequality. right? So if you look at, for example, one particular kind of healthcare delivery, fairly mundane, widespread use is the birth control devices, right? Whether this is the hormonal birth control, whether this is IUDs, etc. That birth control is kind of covered by a patchwork of benefits in Canada rather than universally covered by the healthcare system. Right, so provinces, of course, decide what healthcare they're going to cover, and some of them cover some kinds of birth control and not other kinds. Sometimes you can get healthcare coverage, additional sort of supplementary healthcare coverage that covers your pharmaceuticals, for example, through your workplace. And between insurance and the Medicare, sometimes pills will be covered, IUDs won't, it might be vice versa, etc. When we're talking about contraception, it's very important to understand the social import of birth control and contraception. And the technical development of the birth control pill significantly altered the social norms of sexuality, with the promise of detaching reproduction from sexual pleasure, right? And so created new possibilities for people to have sexual relationships that would in other cases be procreative, and to kind of block the procreative part of that and to create through adult sexuality, create a sort of social system of adult sexuality that that was detached from marriage, that was detached from starting a family, and that was just about pleasure and enjoyment in relationships. It also facilitated the mass movement of women into the labor market. It's really important that you realize that it's not that there were no women in the labor market, but in fact that class and race determined what kinds of women had access to the labor market, mostly because they had to, and which women were left out or excluded from the labor market. Birth control was a moment when things shifted very dramatically, and large-scale numbers of women entered the labor market in the 1970s. And of course, it gave women control over their reproduction. These kinds of technical issues, like the development of a new pill, created all kinds of social changes, and the system of regulation of women's bodies was altered dramatically at this point in time. I want you to see how, in fact, contraception and reproduction are also very important parts of the ways that bodies are socially constructed and also socially regulated. I'm going to move now into the same kind of idea, but give you a much kind of darker example of the social regulation of bodies and reproductive capacities. And this is the topic of eugenics and sterilization. Like the United States, Canada has a dark, dark history of eugenics and sterilization, and like the United States, there are still legacies of that practice that are happening even today. So I want to talk a little bit about eugenics. I think it's really important for us to all understand this history of the relationship between science and racism, to understand that, first of all, that science is always political, always social, and that science is a social institution like any other that is imbued with the inequalities of the social organization that it finds itself in. Eugenics is a pseudoscience, right, that argued that race, first of all, was real and biological, and that through selective breeding of humans, we could create better people. Mostly just took existing stereotypes and false mythologies of race and class that existed in the 1900s, 1910, and 1920s to sort of science them up a bit and to take these kind of ideas of racism and these ideas of the class differences, especially between immigrant groups that were coming to Canada at the time and the powerful whites that were existing, also between the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the whites that were empowered. The way that this unfolded in, in social regulation of sexuality was in this emphasis on children and reproduction, right? And mostly this pseudoscience tried to create a situation where some families were defined as fit and others were defined as unfit, right? So I want to bring this language to your attention because, of course, we live in a moment where fitness is pretty well detached from the idea of eugenics and racism. But in fact, this is the root of this term, that the idea that some families are fit mean that racist ideas and classist ideas about what the best kind of person was like, and of course using a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant model to create a standard that then was measured against individual humans, right? So the idea that you would fit a model better, right? If there was a standard that was like a 6-foot white man, right, that was, that could trace his lineage back to England, right? That was the model. How close your body was to that model was the measurement of fit. And when we say how close your body was, we mean especially like physical, dimensions of your body. Is your nose the right length? Is your hair the right texture? Is the shape and size of your head? Is your jawline close to this model, right? How close do you fit, or how far do you move away, and then for your unfit, right? And so this idea of fitness very much traces back to extremely dangerous racist ideas and the scientific institutions that supported them. And then there were all these false claims of that the closer you were to this fitness, you had better health, you had better success, you had higher intelligence, right? And so basically, the eugenics movement was using sexuality and especially this idea of selective breeding to further racism. And this is the ideology that is behind a lot of dangerous social practices, including sterilization. I want to show you, though, how this just really unfolded. This might be, I'm not sure if this is in Canada or the US, but these kind of eugenics practices was like a super, quote unquote, fun activity that was traveling exhibits brought to state fairs in the US or to kind of festivals and things across the country. So there would be kind of a eugenics exhibit at different kind of fairs and festivals. I'm going to draw your attention to this family who won the Fittest Family Award, this governor's trophy for the fittest family. This was the family that fit the model the best. Have a look here. Here's another winner, in this case the U.S., of a fit family. Notice the sort of extreme light skin, light eyes, very kind of European, almost Aryan kind of look. That was the fittest family. Right? This was the practice through which science produced racism, right? Creating ideal races through sexual matching and marriage. And the better you did this, the more likely you were to win a prize. It both relied on stereotypes, but also created stereotypes and reinforced racist stereotypes. It's very clear to us today that this is an extremely dangerous form of racism, mostly because we are at a different time now. What happened in between the 1920s, when those photos that I showed you were taken, and today, was the Holocaust, right? Nazism, of course, was entirely tied to understandings of eugenics and used this philosophy to govern its political system that regulated racism. And Nazi approaches to race revealed the endpoints, the horrific endpoints of saying that some people were more human or better humans than other races of people. And so while eugenics fell out of favor in Western contexts, there are still remnants of this thinking even today, this idea that some people are better. And I think that if you pay close attention to political discourse, sometimes you can catch a little sniff of eugenics and this kind of intense understanding of race and racism in our political discourse today. I didn't get to sterilization in this video, but the harmful practices within Canada produced state-sanctioned sterilization of people in racial categories, including Black women in the U.S., including Indigenous peoples in Canada, and attacking also people with intellectual disabilities in Canada. And that there have been recent claims even that these kinds of practices are still going on today. And so it might be nice to think that we've put eugenics and the practices like sterilization behind us, but in fact this is still an ongoing problem that we have to deal with today. Sorry to end on such a dark topic, but that is all the time we have today. I want to invite you to read more about it by completing Module 9 and reading all the readings, and then maybe you can counter this negativity and this darkness with all the beams of light that you will bring to the weekly quiz because of all your knowledge on the topic. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.